So yeah, all of our molecules actually look from a chemical structure point of view very similar to the molecules that we would know of as psychedelics, the things like DMT or 5-methoxy-DMT or psilocybin, very similar structurally. It's really amazing once you understand how these molecules bind in the receptors that exist in the human. Just a slight tweak here or there will change what it binds to, what it turns on or off. So they look very, very similar.
Welcome to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. I'm your host, Keith Fiveson. Today we have a very special guest joining us in the studio, Dr. Joseph Tucker, the CEO and director of Envirec Biosciences. Envirec Biosciences is a biotechnology company that is dedicated to developing novel small molecule therapeutics for treatment of anxiety, depression, and addiction disorders. As an industry leader, Dr. Joseph Tucker has an impressive background in building several publicly traded biotechnology companies. He has an in-depth understanding of the industry and works towards providing innovative solutions for mental health disorders. So without further ado, let's dive into the interview with Dr. Joseph Tucker. Hello, Dr. Tucker. How are you? It's so good to see you and have you here. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, hi, Keith. It's really great to be here as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be on the show. I am excited to chat with you and also to tell your audience about what it is Envirec is up to.
Well, I'm incredibly interested in finding out a little bit more about Envirec Biosciences, and I know you've been developing some small molecule therapeutics. I'd like to understand, maybe we can unpack that. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is, and what is Envirec Biosciences all about? What's your work about?
Sure. So what we are excited about in this psychedelic sector, this psychedelic approach to mental health, is the discovery. There's basically been a new class of molecules, of which the psychedelics I would classify as the originals in this new class of molecules, and it's something that is being talked about really at the highest levels of science these days. Science magazine, Nature magazine, the top magazines in the world, journals in the world. And they talk about this new class of molecules called neuroplastogens, or some people call them psychoplastogens. What this really means is a molecule that induces neuroplasticity, causes your brain to rewire. The psychedelics are the first and it's really how we discovered the class. We said, how are psychedelics actually working? And in figuring that out, we realized this was a new mechanism. Induce neuroplasticity, get the brain to rewire itself. So what we're doing at Envirec is we recognize the power, the impact of these molecules on patients. We think it's essential that they be advanced all the way till we actually are able to treat patients with them. And so in chasing that, we've created these new molecules. We've created a whole bunch of new molecules, these neuroplastogens that we are trying to develop clinically and ultimately become treatments for patients.
So when we look at neuroplastogens, are they basically psychedelics without the psychedelic aspect to it? Or are we talking about some capability from a neurogenesis, neuroplasticity viewpoint to be able to go ahead and, let's say, stop the default mode network, go back, deal with trauma, deal with PTSD? Or is there a psychedelic, hallucinogenic kind of component to it?
So we think the answer is both. Neuroplastogens are really defined by the ability to induce neuroplasticity. Some of those, the ones that appear to be honestly the most powerful, the ones where you can take a short course of action, maybe a single event, and have a long-lasting benefit to the patient, subject to integration, of course. That's one class, and those are very powerful. But we've also found a subclass where you can apparently remove the hallucination.
Hmm.
still get the neuroplasticity, still get the benefit. Those ones are not as powerful in, their impact. We think you're going to have to take them repeatedly,
Hmm.
but because they don't cause hallucinations, that's actually fine, right? You wouldn't want to have to take a hallucination inducing thing every single day.
Hmm.
But if it's like taking an Advil, that's no problem. You can take
Hmm.
that every day. So we do actually see both
Hmm.
categories. The molecules seem to fall into one or the other.
Hmm. So when I take a look at, like, for example, SSRIs, so SSRIs, the efficacy rates for SSRIs is it's not maybe 50%. I think normally around 40% or so. And then, of course, there's a numbing effect there. And the big discussion around obviously psychedelics is that there's a reboot, there's a reset, there's a reframe, and then you don't necessarily, after maybe 2, 3, 4 times, efficacy rates are 60, 80%, depending upon what you're doing, depending upon the therapeutic approach. And then you're talking about these, neuroplastogens without the psychedelics and the ability to go ahead and take those. But it sounds a little bit more like an SSRI in the fact that you have to take it every day. But the difference being is that you're not numbed and you're not dealing with the trauma or the PTSD that you might get, like a scratched record that keeps bringing you back to some event that really upsets you and doesn't allow you to be present. So I'm just wondering, do I get that right in terms of what Enverec is up to in terms of the neuroplastogens, or the other one was the psychoplastogens? Did I?
But yeah, it's another term. It's
Another
another
term.
term,
Okay.
means the same thing. Yes.
Same thing.
Yeah. So I think I follow you,
Hmm.
Keith. And I would say, so first off, with regard to what we refer to as the classic
Hmm.
psychedelics, the ones which do induce the hallucinations, it still remains to be seen in the larger context
Hmm.
of the broad clinical trials. Is it truly going to be 60%, 80%? Is it going to last for a year?
Hmm.
Let's see, right? Like, we're all crossing our fingers. We
Hmm.
want that to be the case. But often early studies
Hmm.
are very narrow in the patient populations. And so you can you can get a better result in those early studies than you do in
Right.
your big phase threes. And that's, of course, why you do big, broad phase threes.
Right.
Having
And it all depends on the setting and the
mm,
integration and the capability to go ahead and really work on the issue, right?
right, exactly. So in the real world,
Hmm.
it may not be so easy. Like you just said, if the integration, for example, is very important, and if the integration is handled differently by different
Hmm.
service providers, then you may not get that same benefit that you saw in
Hmm.
those early narrow studies. Having said that, what we see with both classes of neuroplastogens, both the ones that induce hallucinations and the ones that don't, the real sort of excitement here is that it appears to be a different mechanism of action than has
Hmm.
previously been pursued. And that makes sense because we're actually hitting a different receptor now. We're hitting the
Hmm.
5-HT2A, where before all previous drugs tried to avoid the 5-HT2A.
Hmm.
So because we're going through this different receptor, it makes sense. And why that's significant is because it means generally it's additive,
Hmm.
so complementary or maybe even synergistic with other treatment modalities, right? So you're not, the person's only 40%. And I agree with you. It's like
Hmm.
40%
Hmm.
success in things like SSRIs.
Hmm.
Well, this is maybe you don't have to take the person off SSRIs. You can keep SSRIs going and do this,
Hmm.
and together you'll get a better response.
Hmm.
And there has been a few early clinical studies that actually do suggest a synergy, that the two
Hmm.
together are better than either one by themselves. So
Hmm.
that's the excitement.
Hmm.
Coming at different mechanism. I would agree that the hallucination inducing one seems to be really powerful, really durable effect, but it's
Hmm.
not something you want to do every day,
Hmm.
right? So maybe that's the sort of initial phase when you're dealing with a crisis or you've got
Hmm.
somebody in a very difficult situation. and then you have the maintenance dose, the non-hallucination that you
Mm.
can keep them on long term. May make a lot of sense
Mhm.
to think of the two in that
Mhm.
context.
Well, this is a very complex issue, isn't it? I mean, and that's why the research and that's why the studies are really so important. Companies like yours are really helping to lead the way in terms of the research and the development. And I'm wondering when you start taking a look at the issues, tackling the issues around mental health and these disorders, how have you been able to address, you know, uh, you know, difficult problems like mental health to address address these issues. Whereas you mentioned traditional methods might be the SSRIs, and how do you go ahead and do these studies? What does it look like, and where is what's the process? If you can kind of help us walk through that, and I'm also very interested in what the chemical components are in terms of the hallucinogenics. Are they similar to psilocybin and so on? If you can talk to that, that would be great.
Sure, I'll try to answer your questions in
Yeah,
reverse
sorry,
order.
I know I have a lot there. Yeah.
No, it's great. It's fun to unpack with you.
Mhm,
So, yeah, all of our molecules
mhm,
actually look from a chemical structure point of view very similar to
mhm,
the molecules that we would know of as psychedelics, the
mhm,
things like DMT or 5-methoxy DMT or
mhm,
psilocybin, very similar structurally. It's
mhm,
really amazing once you understand how these molecules bind in the receptors
mhm,
that exist in the human. Just a slight tweak here or there will change what it binds to, what it turns on or off. So
mhm.
they look very, very similar. Whether they're hallucination inducing or not, they actually look quite similar.
Yeah.
In terms of running the clinical trials, they really do fall into the two categories are quite different from each other. Honestly, when you have the hallucinogenic molecule, as we've seen from the clinical trials that MAPS has run, that Compass
Mhm,
has run, that other companies have run, with when you're inducing that hallucination, as you said, the set and setting is very
mhm,
important. The um, the pre therapeutic sort of dialogue, setting the stage, and then the integration on the backside, all very controlled. You need to have two healthcare providers there with you for the entire time.
mhm,
And by the way, those trials look like they're going to lead to a requirement for all of that I just described
mhm.
on the label. So that doesn't currently exist right now, but
On the what? What was that?
sorry, on the label. So in other
On the
words,
label. On label. Okay.
when the drug is approved,
Mhm.
it's not, you're going to need to do all of that stuff that you
Right.
had to do through the clinical trial. So it's very involved. There are only certain places that you
Mhm,
can do that.
mhm,
A lot of skills required.
mhm.
Looked
Right.
like were you going to say something, Keith?
No, I was just going to say, it
Yeah.
sounds to me like when you say on label, like for example, like MAPS is doing their MDMA trials. They just finished up stage 3, and then there is a requirement. There was a requirement for 2 therapists in the room.
Hmm.
A certain amount of time. Obviously, I think it was 4 hour, three to two, 4 and 2, or maybe 4 and 4. But in terms of hours of preparation, journeying, and then integration work. So is that what you're talking about when you say on the label? Yeah.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So as opposed to, most drugs, they don't have that kind of a requirement. It's you have this indication,
Hmm.
the doctor says you have this indication and you're not, pregnant or whatever, you can take the drug.
Right.
But that's not what this looks like right now. Those are much more complicated. You have to do all of these things in this way or else you can't be prescribed the drug. So those are limiting. You have to recognize those are limiting. So those are complex trials to run. And I think one of the biggest issues that has become very clear, and I was at this really interesting scientific conference a few weeks ago now, maybe it's a month ago now, where the absolute leaders in the field. So the chief scientific officers, chief medical officers of Delix and Gilgamesh and Compass and
Hmm.
Cybin, like they were all there. We were all there. It was a really small conference.
Hmm.
There was kind of like 50 scientists
Yeah.
and 50 other people trying to sell stuff to the scientists.
Right.
But it was a small conference, and we were talking about what we're learning. And one
Hmm.
of the things is the number one predictor of success in a clinical trial is whether or not the patient thinks they got a psychedelic agent. Number one predictor. So controlling is a big issue here, because that's not cool with the FDA, right? You want to get something approved, you've got to show that it actually works. And if it's the number one thing is they think they got it. So the clinical trials, the control on those clinical trials is a big question. Do you give somebody low dose psilocybin? Do you give somebody something which makes them feel funny, but it's not a psychedelic? What do you do? So it makes it a bit of a hairball, honestly, to do those trials.
Right.
The much easier trials are the non-hallucinogenic, because you don't have to control for, did the person think they got a psychedelic agent? And, frankly, it's a lot less obvious, right? You really don't know. So those are run much more like classic big pharma studies, much more straightforward to run.
It sounds a lot like a lot like microdosing in some way, because within the microdosing trend, if you will, a lot of people are talking about the opportunity to shut down the default mode network, to be able to go ahead and not ruminate, not go ahead and deal with PTSD or trauma in the same way, be able to unfurl traumatic memories, or being able to be more present, if you will, for whatever is going on. And it sounds very, very, very similar when you start taking a look at the non-hallucinogenic. And then the other side of it, I do understand when you're, taking an hallucinogenic, you want to, at least in terms of the control, you want to go ahead and make sure that the setting, and the integration, at least the parameters are there, obviously, so that the person can, unhook from, or unburden themselves, perhaps, from what they heard, what they saw, what they heard, what they understood as a part of their journey. How, if you're doing a non-hallucinogenic, obviously there is no journey time. You just take the pill, and then you're able to, you feel pretty good. Now, you've got this thing, it's, I guess, your lead program, something called the EVM 201 series. Can you tell me a little bit about that, and how it offers this new approach to treatment of psychiatric disorders?
Sure. And again, you've got a really packed full series of questions there. I love it. So if I can answer your very first one,
please. I'm sorry. I'm just so excited that we're talking about this stuff. It's very interesting to me.
No, I love it. I love the dialogue, Keith. Absolutely. So to answer your first question, is it a lot like microdosing? Yes, it's a lot like microdosing. The distinction would be, because we're tweaking the molecules, we think we can actually keep the neuroplasticity induction higher than if you were simply to take, say, psilocybin and dose it lower. So we think, you get a more potent effect with, let's say, the same amount of side effect, if that makes sense. Okay. That's the rationale behind that. Now, I think your kind of final question was, what's 201? How does that work? So 201, the 201 series, that's the one that we drew out, the molecule we call 373, the lead molecule. So that is the hallucination-inducing molecule, very similar in some ways to psilocybin, induces those hallucinations. The distinction would be, and I've got to, qualify this with in animals, because we haven't got human data yet. But in animals, the distinction is we designed it specifically to get to the patient's brain faster and to leave the body more quickly, and also to avoid the gut. Psilocybin is administered orally because in the gut, it separates into the active ingredient. But the receptors, there's even more receptors for psilocybin in the gut than there is in the brain. So a lot of people vomit after having had psilocybin. So this avoids that by avoiding the gut and avoiding having that low dose. So,
that's the 201, yeah?
That's the 201, exactly. So ultimately the idea is think psilocybin, but faster on, faster off, less GI upset.
Mm-hmm.
That's the theory. But then otherwise, the paradigm follows in the footsteps of psilocybin. Give it to patients,
Mm-hmm.
control the set and setting, and it may well be that you have to do 2 or 3 treatments and then look for a durable response. That's how we see that. That's the paradigm for that one.
I see. So let me ask, what's the response from the medical community about, looking at this EVM 201, as you say, the lead molecule? What's their response in general?
Yes. So I would now, as you can imagine, we've had lots of communications with folks in the medical community and the psychiatric community in particular as well. And I would say groups, they generally fall into 2 groups. The larger group, honestly, is conservative and doesn't really get excited about anything that induces hallucinations, whether it's what Compass is doing, what MAPS is doing. That's probably the larger group that says, there's a lot of issues and a lot of my patients aren't going to want to do that. That's one response. There's another group, and it's very material, that says, my patients are really in dire straits. This seems to be working. I'm really excited. And the response that we get is, they always say, how does this compare to psilocybin? And I say to them what I just said to you about faster on, faster off, less GI upset. And every one of them says, oh, that would be really good. So that is the response we're getting, is that from the point of view of the caregiver, they think that it'll be a significant advantage over what is currently being anticipated to come out from those leading programs, the ones that are in late stage clinical trials right now.
So I also know that you've got this 301, and that's the one without the psychedelics. That's the one without the hallucinogen, right?
Yes.
So within that area, is there a different thought process from the medical community looking at the 301 versus the 201? Because 201 sounds like psilocybin without the upset, without, and certainly when you look at a pill, and the pharmacology of it, you're able to go ahead and maybe go to the doctor or get a prescription, and you have a broader range. Certainly, it sounds like with the 301 versus the 201, which might not get the broader adoption because of the hallucinogenic quality. Is that true? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's very accurate, Keith. And I have to say, we were actually almost a little surprised at how much greater the interest is in that non-hallucinogenic, being kind of, embedded in the whole psychedelic sector. We, like everybody else, see the benefit from the hallucination-inducing molecules, but boy, both the medical community and the pharmaceutical and big biotech community are super excited about the non-hallucinogenics. I could give you example after example of conferences I've gone to, and that's all they want to talk about. They see the potential for the same benefit that we've all seen out of the early clinical trials and the hallucination inducing ones, these massive 60-80% kind of response rates that last for a long period of time. It's the same mechanism, right? So they're saying you should be able to get the same kind of response, but without these major side effects from a patient adoption point of view, from a caregiver comfort point of view, from a commercialization point of view. And as you said, now this is something you can prescribe and take it home. You don't have to go into an office. You don't have you don't have to control set and setting, all of that. Huge like I said, it's surprising to me how much greater the interest is in that, but it definitely is.
Now, when we started to talk about the difference now between 201 and 301, I want to go back to this, how you introduce them from a viewpoint of neuroplasticity. And I want to maybe unpack that a little bit more in terms of the importance of neuroplasticity in the treatment of mental health disorders. And, how does it work? And, when we start taking a look at the 201 versus the 301, is there obviously taking one every day versus, taking 2 or 3 times, and then you're maybe done for a little while, although the research, as we said, isn't in on that. But can you talk about the neuroplasticity model and why is that so important in either the 201 or the 301?
Sure. So, and this is, this is cutting edge science. This is actually being debated right now on the front pages of Nature and Science as we speak. But the leading minds out there believe that what's going on is you can actually measure a reduction in connectivity between a couple of regions of the brain, in particular the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Now, the amygdala near your brainstem is this ancient piece of the brain whose goal is to identify incoming threats as threats and stimulate the fight or flight response, stimulate emotions, fear, terror, anger, whatever, and also stimulate you to take action. Run like hell, for example. Right. The prefrontal cortex is this much newer piece of the brain that goes, hold on a second. Right. That was just a television show you were watching, or that was a flashback. That's not a real threat. Take it easy. And so this is called top-down control from the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, to the amygdala. That seems to be negatively impacted. You can actually see less firing, less connection between those two regions of the brain in patients that are suffering from these indications. And it gets worse. If you have chronic depression, it gets worse over time, gets worse and worse. And so you really want to turn that around. So what's going on at the cellular level seems to be this rewiring. It's not actually neurogenesis, which is creating new tissue. And there is some of that you see out of the hippocampus. But in this case, it's neuroplasticity. The existing neurons are forming new connections. And you end up with more firing just from the existing tissue. And the idea is that seems to turn up the ability of the PFC to tamp down on those negative things coming out of the amygdala. And that's basically the gist of what we think is going on. There's some arguments right now. Is it G protein coupled or beta arrestin, the two different downstream routes? And there's arguments, is it hyperplasticity or is it metaplasticity? There's a bunch of hand waving going on from some guys that are way smarter than me. But the gist is you got to increase the wiring in these key regions of the brain. That's what it is we're trying to do. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, that answers it quite a bit. I've been practicing mindfulness and meditation for over 30 years, and a lot of the work around that, of course, shows that, by just learning how to breathe, by just learning how to presence yourself, by just learning how to just be aware of what's going on, from a sensory viewpoint and a body viewpoint, and what your thoughts are, to be able to change move a muscle, change a thought, stimulus response, open the gap, look at the window of tolerance, being able to go ahead and widen that gap so that you're not too hyper, you're not too hypo, but you're right in the window. And it sounds like this medicine is really helping to do that. And that's very exciting.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is the same thing. That's what's going on, is it's coming at it from two different ways. And so I'm of the firm belief that you want to do both. The kind of mindfulness, or if it's integration or whatever it is, whatever is your way that's non-pharmaceutical, but you're doing the same thing. You're making the brain more open to forming new connections, new meanings, new understandings, or coming up with a new meaning for stuff. So yeah, you can do that through mindfulness. And now for the first time, maybe we can do that pharmaceutically. I think do them both. I think you're going to have, that's going to be your best response, is if you do, this kind of work and have a pharmaceutical boost to it. 1 + 1 is 3.
Right. And then you're able to go ahead and at least spread, have a continuum, have a maintenance program to be able to understand what is going on. And, it would seem to me that, I'm a vet and I'm a member of the Heroic Hearts Project, and I will be facilitating a panel over at Wonderland on the use of ketamine. And, when we start taking a look at Enverec, I mean, you're basically taking plants and, psychedelics, traditional psychedelics, and then you're manipulating the compounds in them in certain ways to go ahead and get different results, or to go ahead and attenuate or allow the individual to get the results that they need without the hallucinogenics, right? So I'm wondering, this sounds to me like it would be a hands down kind of like, oh yeah, let's make this happen. Why are we waiting? But I'm sure that you're dealing with some challenges and some roadblocks. Can you speak to those in terms of, what are some of the challenges, or what are some of the roadblocks in dealing with these therapeutics?
Sure, yeah. So, and we are coming out of an era where for the last 50 years, psychedelics have been, very, very taboo, very stigmatized, and mental health also very stigmatized, something to talk about. So it's not like everybody is happy to talk about these things conversationally. There's still a lot of that we as a society are getting over, but luckily we are. Now, from the point of view of developing, I think there's a few different challenges that you have to kind of weave your way through. One, you've got the existing molecules that are already out there that are somewhat accessible to people. And so there's some danger of these molecules being used inappropriately or in a dangerous fashion. I mean, there was that report just recently about the airline pilot who trying to crash a plane and was blaming his use of a psychedelic agent. So whether or not that's true, there's still some concerns out there. And to the extent those could be overblown again, to the extent people could go too far down the wrong path and end up with a backlash again, that would be negative. So that's one thing I do worry about. Another thing is, we are, on the other hand, saying we're going to make completely novel molecules, but we're making completely novel molecules in a whole new arena, something that's never been done before. A psychedelic that's non-hallucinogenic, that's tricky. Or a psychedelic agent, modify it, and then try to go through the classic pharma clinical trial process that, as we mentioned, is challenging, right? If your number one predictor is whether or not you think you were given a psychedelic agent, and it's pretty darn obvious whether or not you were given a psychedelic agent, more challenges. You take all of that, and you want your one more challenge. Well, the whole world got super excited about psychedelics 2 years ago and funded everything. Now, in late 2023, the whole finance world has walked away from psychedelics. So they funded way too many things before, and now they're not funding enough things today. So it's all of those are the the various challenges that we have to juggle as we try to weave our way through this minefield that we're in.
Right, and I can't imagine. I mean, when you take a look at where the marketplace is going, we have California, we have Oregon, we have Denver, all of which are now legalizing these plants as from a controlled substance viewpoint. It's looking at, they're still illegal, but the actual ability to go ahead and enforce those laws it's been minimized. So, and then we start taking a look at the popularity of all these plants. So I can't imagine that in the pharmaceutical area, when you're looking to go ahead and create these pharmaceuticals that really mimic the same capabilities, that it's going to be an easy road to hoe. It's just going to be challenging.
Yeah, I agree. Certainly on the non-hallucinogenic side, no problem. Right. But with regard to the molecules that do induce hallucinations, it's going to be challenging. What I am somewhat heartened by is the dialogues that we've had with the DEA and that we've had with the FDA to date. They are actually ultimately very reasonable. I can't believe I'm saying it. I probably would not believe I was saying this if you'd asked me this 3 years ago. But there's, show us that this works. We recognize that there are major mental health issues. And if you show us that this works in controlled setting and that you can control for the risks, we can manage the scheduling of your molecule. We can manage the approval of this molecule and make it into something that you can actually get to the patients. So that part is actually somewhat heartening. It is going to be a challenge to be able to prove efficacy against this backdrop of the control issue that I brought up, the negative control. And some people are trying to sidestep that entirely by not having what they call an active control. So there are ways to do it, but it's not going to be the easiest, clinical program that there's ever been out there because of all these challenges, all this hair on it. But it's certainly worth doing. I mean, as a society, we're long overdue. I think.
Yeah, it's time for a change. Yeah.
Yeah, almost everybody has. I mean, sure, you go global, you look at all the people, as huge percentage of the population deals with this, but it's very personal too, right? I think almost everybody, if they don't have something themselves, occasionally they've got somebody in their family, a close personal friend. I know I do, right? And it's very personal, and it's we need to do something. This is huge. And the FDA and the DEA get that, right? So they just want us to do our part, make something, show that it works, and they'll help us get it the rest of it.
So I have a question for you, and I want you to put your genie hat on and maybe be a bit of a soothsayer, and really give me your perspective on what you think the future of mental health therapeutics, like maybe the 301. I know we talk about the 201. I know there's plant medicines out there and so on and so forth, but we're really talking about, in this case, mental health therapeutics, such as what Enverec Biosciences is producing. Where do you think we're going with this? And I know that you're the CEO of the company, so you're certainly going to have some perspective around that in terms of the mission and the vision. So that's why I'm asking.
Sure, yeah. So I think, having been a scientist by training, but a drug developer for the last 20, 25 years in my career, what I've seen is it's extremely rare for one to get mainstream adoption of a new class of drug that's not regulatory approved, not FDA approved. You just don't see reimbursers covering it. You don't see patients feeling safe taking it. You don't see doctors feeling safe prescribing it. So this means we're going to go through the FDA, which means, most of anything that's really out there that's about, well, I'm going to be able to buy psilocybin at the street corner and I won't go to jail for it, or I'm going to be able to grow my own psilocybin. Maybe, but I don't think that's going to become a meaningful component of how we treat mental health. It's going to be what's FDA approved and reimburser reimbursed.
At least for the broad population.
For the broad population, exactly. And I'm talking broad strokes. There will always be people that are self-medicating, and just be careful. So what I have to say to those folks. But for the broad population, it's going to be those things which are FDA approved. What I've seen is, as I mentioned, a huge amount of interest from the non-hallucinogenic side. Now, when I look at it, I go, this hallucination-inducing seems to be very powerful, but I think it's ultimately going to be kind of a niche product. It will be used maybe in extreme cases, or maybe in a smaller subset of the population. And I can see it being let's say an initial induction phase or crisis management phase. But I think the bulk of this is going to go over to the non-hallucinogenics. And I also think that, as we've seen in pharma for the last 200 years, is you never have one drug take the entire market. You never have that, especially if there have been drugs out there that have some efficacy. What you see is it becomes part of the pharmacopoeia. So I think you ask, what's the future going to look like? I think SSRIs are still going to be there. SNRIs are still going to be there. Beta blockers are still going to be there. And this will be a component. And it might be the most exciting component and the largest component for the next 10 years. But it'll just be a component, and it'll be all part of, and I am very hopeful that people will continue to use psychotherapy, integration, the mindfulness, because that actually, in my opinion, is partly how this works. It's you gotta attack these problems from multiple angles. But I'm excited to have a new tool, something that's different, a new mechanism that's never been used before. And my fervent hope is that it will be very synergistic with everything else that's going on.
Well, it's very, very, very exciting to think about the revolution and the evolution of mental health care and the ability to go ahead and use these tools, if you will, to go ahead and explore, to rewire, reset, reframe, the mind and the experience, someone's, self-referential experience, so that they are able to go ahead and function. And it sounds like the 301, certainly the 201, but then, as you say, the 301 series, the EVM 301 series has a broader appeal, because then you're not numbing or blunting the individual. You're giving them the opportunity to just be present for whatever shows up in their lives, without ruminating about stress or trauma or PTSD or whatever happened, whether or not it's explicit or implicit, or whatever they're trying to, and to your point, to have those therapeutic tools like psychotherapy or mindfulness, or the right diet, the right exercise, all that other stuff, which really contributes to it. That's very exciting, and I'm excited to have you as a guest here. Can you provide any insights, perhaps on any upcoming programs or developments in your pipeline, and also how people can find out more about NVREC, and get a hold of you, maybe?
Sure. So to answer the last question first, we do have obviously a website, and we use the typical media, social media platforms to get our press releases. And we have had quite a robust press release year, and I think we'll continue to do so. So it's definitely a place to go to follow the company, and the contact info is, of course, all on the website. So we're always receiving inbound inquiries from interested folks. And in regard to what the future will bring, beyond the 201 with the hallucination inducing, and the 301, the non-hallucinogenic program, we've actually also seen within our large portfolio, and I didn't mention this, but in our efforts to create new molecules, we created more than 1,000 novel compounds that we've been testing. And we've realized that there are actually several other, let's say, subclasses within the non-hallucinogenic side that are very intriguing, that seem to hit other receptors. So things based on the MDMA structure, things based on what some people know as the 2C structure, and things based on the mescaline structure, where we have potential to go into a number of other really interesting different indications. So in particular, abuse disorders like alcohol, food, opiate abuse disorders, and even interestingly, sleep disorders. There's some really interesting molecules that we're finding. So our pipeline is so deep. We could spend forever. We won't spend forever, but we could spend a lot of time digging our way through the pipeline. So a lot of interesting stuff still to come that's come out of our discovery platform. Right now, though, we are absolutely focused on getting these lead molecules into humans and show what they can do.
Exciting stuff. NVREC, ENVERIC Biosciences, and you're on the NASDAQ at ENVB, is that right?
That's right, ENVB.
Okay, great. And again, thank you, Dr. Joseph Tucker, for being on the Mindfulness Experience podcast. I really appreciate the time you've given us, and it's just great to hear what's happening in the field of mental health care.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was great. Love to talk about what we're doing. I'm so excited and passionate about it, as is the whole team. So any chance to talk about it, of course, I jump at. So thank you for having me on the show.
You're welcome. That was an enlightening conversation with Dr. Joseph Tucker, CEO and Director of NVREC Biosciences. He's provided us with a lot of insightful information on how the industry is evolving to tackle the issues of mental health disorders. At Enverec Biosciences, they're working to provide innovative solutions that offer the safe and effective treatment options. And we hope this interview has been really insightful to you, our listeners, and we welcome you to join us on the next Mindfulness Experience podcast. In the meantime, stay mindful and stay wise. Thank you.